Every culture that has ever existed has told a version of the same story. A hero leaves home, faces monsters, gets lost, seduced, tested, almost destroyed, and after years, sometimes decades, finally returns. We call it the hero's journey. We teach it in film school, we map it onto Star Wars, The Lion King, and almost every story that seems to work across time. But here's what nobody tells you about the structure of the story. It's not only about the journey, it's about why the hero cannot come home. Not why the monsters are in the way, not why the gods are against him, but why he, with all his intelligence, all his cunning, and all his genuine desire to return, keeps extending the very suffering he's trying to end. The ancient Greek poet Homer wrote the answer to that question more than 2,800 years ago. Carl Jung rediscovered it much later and gave it a psychological name, the shadow. And in this video, I want to show you that the Odyssey, one of the oldest stories in civilization, is not just an adventure story. It is one of the most precise psychological maps we have of what the shadow does to a person who refuses to accept it. I'm Dimitris, I study psychology, and in my work with clients, I see a version of this pattern again and again. People who are capable, intelligent, self-aware, sometimes even exceptional, but who keep finding themselves in the same loop. The same kind of relationship, but with a different person. The same professional career rise, followed by the same collapse. The same feeling of moving, surviving, even winning, but never arriving. This is why the monsters are not the real problem in the Odyssey. They never were. The real question is not what stands between Odysseus and Ithaca. The real question is what inside Odysseus keeps making Ithaca harder to reach. But before we meet the monsters, we need one Jungian idea so that we can unlock the psychology behind Odyssey. Carl Jung believed that the psyche is always trying to move toward wholeness, not perfection, but integration, the process of becoming who you actually are, not who your family needed you to be, not the persona you built to survive, not the version of yourself that learned which parts were acceptable and which parts had to disappear. So Jung called this process individuation, but standing between us and that wholeness is the shadow part of ourselves. The shadow is not your evil side. It's not your inner demon. Think of it as the sum of everything you learned, usually at a very young age, that you could not afford to be. Maybe it was your anger. Maybe it was your neediness. Maybe it was your ambition. Maybe it was your sensitivity. Maybe it even was your pride. The part of you that knew what you were capable of, but learned that showing that part could cost you something. Whichever it was, it did not disappear. It went underground. And when something inside us remains unconscious, Jung believed that does not simply stays hidden. It starts shaping our life, and we call it fate. It comes as patterns that we can clearly see in everyone else, but somehow we cannot see in ourselves. So Homer did not have Jung's vocabulary. He didn't know what the shadow is, he didn't know the word individuation or collective unconscious or even unconscious. What he had was Odysseus. And across 10 years of wandering, across every monster, every goddess, every temptation, every delay and every catastrophe, Homer shows us what the shadow does to a person who's almost ready to come home to himself, but not quite yet. First we have the Cyclops, the inflated ego. See, the first major shadow encountered in the Odyssey happens very early in the myth. Odysseus and his crew arrive at an island inhabited by the Cyclopes, a race of one-eyed giants who live without laws, without community and without accountability. Homer is very precise here. The Cyclopes are not evil in any organized sense. They are simply unreflected. They never had to answer to anyone but themselves. Against the advice of his own men, Odysseus insists of entering the cave of one of them. His name is Polyphemus, the son of Poseidon. He wants to know what kind of creature he is. He wants another experience, another story, another adventure. His men know it's a mistake, but he does it anyway. Polyphemus returns to the cave, he seals the cave with a boulder no man could move, and begins killing and eating Odysseus' crew. The disaster is immediate, and it is entirely self-created. But Odysseus is brilliant, so he gets the Cyclops drunk. So when Polyphemus asks his name, Odysseus replies, "I'm nobody." Once the giant collapses asleep, Odysseus and his men sharpen a wooden stake and drive it into his single eye. Blinded and screaming, Polyphemus calls for help. The others ask, "Who is hurting you?" And he replies, "Nobody." So they think he's too drunk and they leave. So Odysseus and his men manage to escape. They reach their ship, they're safe, and the danger is over. And then Odysseus makes the decision that changes the rest of his life. He turns around and shouts back across the sea. And he shouts at Polyphemus, and he tells him, "If anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus, king of Ithaca." His crew begs him to stop. Instead, he shouts even louder. Now Polyphemus knows exactly who his enemy is. And he calls upon his father, Poseidon, god of the sea, to curse the man who blinded him. And Poseidon answers. What should have been the end of the journey becomes 10 more years of wandering, 10 more years of storms, of shipwrecks, of monsters, the loss of every single member of his crew. Not because Odysseus wasn't intelligent enough, because at the moment of victory, he could not remain anonymous. And this is where Jung becomes useful. The cave represents the unconscious. It's dark, it's enclosed, it's primitive. It's ruled by instinct rather than reflection. And Polyphemus is not simply a monster. He is an image of the unexamined psyche, a mind that is driven entirely by appetite and is incapable of seeing beyond its own immediate reality. And notice something here. He has only one eye. A single eye cannot perceive depth. It sees only what is directly in front of it. In psychological terms, that is exactly how an unintegrated shadow behaves. It sees only its own perspective. Odysseus enters this world believing that intelligence alone will protect him. And in the immediate crisis, it does. His cleverness gets everyone out alive. But the real battle begins after the danger has passed, because the shadow is not only inside Polyphemus, it is inside Odysseus too. His shadow is pride, not ordinary pride. The deeper need to be recognized. The need for the world to know that he was the man who accomplished the impossible. So when he was inside the cave, he called himself nobody, and this is what saved him. Outside the cave, he can no longer tolerate being nobody. So the cave representing the unconscious, when we are inside there, we're humbled and we know we're nobody. When we come outside to our conscious, we want to shout out to the world that we are someone. And that is Odysseus' tragedy as well. The shadow of pride rarely destroys us during the difficult part. It waits until we have succeeded. It waits until the only thing left to do is to quietly accept the victory. And then it whispers, make sure they know it was you. And I think almost everyone watching this video has lived some version of that moment. Maybe you handled a conflict perfectly. Maybe you negotiated something difficult. Maybe you walked away from someone with dignity and restraint. And then, once it was over, something inside you needed one last word, one last message, one last email, one last comment. Not because it could change anything, but because someone had to know, someone had to recognize what you had done. And in that moment, you gave away the peace you have already earned. Jung wrote that when something inside us remains unconscious, it appears outside as fate. Odysseus didn't experience this as pride. His experience was that this is justice. I deserve recognition because I made it. That is what makes the shadow so dangerous. It never feels like shadow. It feels like you're finally doing the right thing. So the question isn't whether you have a shadow of pride. We all do. The question is whether you can recognize it in the moment your ship is already sailing away, whether you can feel that urge to turn around and shout and choose to remain Nobody. Because sometimes that's the only thing standing between you and Ithaca. And now we are going to Circe's island, the unreflected self. This is the encounter that's perhaps the most subtle of them all. Not because it's the most dramatic. It isn't. There are no monsters, there are no giants, there are no life or death situation. There's just simply an island, a house hidden in the woods, a goddess named Circe, and men who walk through her door as human beings and walk out as pigs. Homer introduces Circe as a sorceress of extraordinary power. She welcomes Odysseus and his exhausted crew with food and wine. They have survived the Cyclops. They have endured loss after loss. They have survived the big waves, and now they are hungry. They are emotionally depleted and desperate for somewhere that is finally safe. They accept her hospitality without any hesitation, and they start eating and drinking. And with a single touch of her wand, they are transformed into animals, but not metaphorically, literally. Imagine men who have been fighting for their lives for years, finally arriving somewhere where it's warm, where it's comfortable and it's welcoming, only to discover that the very place that gave them relief slowly stripped away what made them human. And the crucial detail here is that they never realize that it's even happening. They don't choose to become pigs. They simply stop paying attention. And by the time they understand what had happened, they have already become something they no longer recognize and they cannot escape from. And I think every one of us has experienced the same version of that transformation. Maybe it was a relationship, maybe it was a job, maybe a family dynamic, maybe simply a version of yourself that slowly developed over years without you even consciously choosing. You didn't wake up one morning and decide to become smaller, to become quieter, to become colder or more defensive. It just happens gradually, one compromise at a time, one accommodation after the other, until one day you realize you are no longer behaving like the person you believed yourself to be. Sometimes it looks like becoming less creative because the environment rewards conformity. Some other times it means becoming less honest because honesty creates conflict. Sometimes it means becoming emotionally numb because feeling too much becomes exhausting. Other times it goes the opposite direction. You become more cynical, you become more controlling, you become more strategic about things because those are the qualities that allowed you to survive the environment you were in. For example, in a corporate setup. Either way, something essential from your identity, from your qualities, starts to disappear. And this is why I think Homer chose pigs. Not because pigs are evil, because they live entirely through appetite, instinct without reflection, comfort without awareness. It's just immediate gratification without questioning whether the life they're living is actually their own. Carl Jung would describe this as a form of shadow possession. This is when a part of ourselves begins running our lives without our awareness. And when this is happening, we don't feel possessed. We simply feel normal. The transformation happens so gradually that we mistake adaptation for identity. And this is why Circe's island is so psychologically interesting. Nothing there looks dangerous. The danger is comfort without consciousness. And here we can explore one more term from Jung's language. We're not going to go too much into it, but he spoke about the part of ourselves that he called anima. That's the part of the psyche connected with feeling, connected with relationship, with imagination, with inner life. So when we have a conscious relationship with that part of ourselves, it becomes a guide. It helps us mature. But when it remains unconscious, it becomes something very different. It offers comfort without truth, recognition without growth, acceptance without transformation. And sometimes that feels remarkably similar to love. And I've seen this same pattern so many times. People come to me and describe relationships and they tell me, for example, I could completely be like myself, or they understood me completely without me having to explain anything. And sometimes this is genuine intimacy, but sometimes the real question is different. Who exactly were they understanding? Were they recognizing the fullest version of you, or simply the version of you that never tried to grow. Sometimes what feels like unconditional acceptance is simply the absence of challenge. And sometimes that feels like home because it's a place where nobody asks anything more of what you're giving them in the moment. The most common example, the most common phrase that I'm sure you have heard, stay as you are. You're perfect as you are. That is Circe's gift, the comfort. And that is also the danger. Now let me tell you what happens when Odysseus arrives, because unlike his crew, he doesn't enter the house unprepared. Before reaching Circe's home, the god Hermes meets him and gives him a mysterious plant called moly. Homer tells us that the roots of this mysterious plant are black and its flower is white, which is a beautiful image of something that grows from darkness toward light. And when Odysseus receives it, Circe's magic has no effect on him. And I don't think Homer is really talking about a magical herb here. I think he's talking about awareness. Odysseus is not protected because he's stronger than his men. He's just as exhausted, he's just as lonely, as depleted, and as broken by all the misfortunes that happened. The difference is that he walks into the encounter already knowing something about himself. He arrives conscious, and that changes everything. When Circe tries to transform him and fails, she immediately recognizes him. She knows that she cannot manipulate anyone who already understands the forces that operate inside him. And that may be one of the deepest psychological lessons in the Odyssey. The greatest protection against manipulation is not intelligence. It's self-knowledge. But Homer doesn't stop there. Most stories would have Odysseus defeat Circe and continue his journey. Instead, he stays for an entire year. So once the enchantment is broken and the relationship becomes conscious, Circe transforms from captor into teacher. She teaches him things. She tells him about his future dangers. She restores his men. And most importantly, she gives Odysseus the knowledge that he will need for every encounter that comes, for every challenge that follows. So the same woman who could have destroyed him becomes one of his greatest allies. And that completely changes the psychological lesson, because the point is not to avoid every difficult person or every dangerous relationship. The point is to stop entering them unconsciously. The very same experience that destroys one part of you can become the experience that matures another part of you. The difference is rarely about the situation itself. It is about the level of consciousness you bring into every situation you walk into. Because I've seen people emerge from difficult, painful relationships carrying wisdom they could not have acquired any other way. Not because suffering is inherently noble, but because the experience forced them to confront the part of themselves that had entered the relationship hungry, unaware, and looking for someone else to tell them who they are. That is what therapy often looks like. Not avoiding Circe, but developing your own moly, the plant, before you meet her. And Homer leaves us with one final detail that I think is extraordinary, which is that when Circe restores Odysseus' men, they do not simply become human again. Homer says they return taller, they return younger and more beautiful than before. So psychologically, that is a profound statement, because healing is not returning to who you were before life wounded you. It is becoming someone larger because of the encounter. The journey into the shadow is never meant to return you to the place where you were, to your old self. It is meant to introduce you to the person you were capable of becoming since the beginning. And now we'll go to the island of the Sirens, the seduction of self-destruction. And this encounter is completely different. With Polyphemus, the danger was obvious. There was a giant, a cave, men were eaten alive. The threat had a body, it had a voice, it had a weight you could measure. The Sirens are different. The danger is the song. And Homer tells us that the Sirens live on a rocky island surrounded by the bones of every sailor who has ever sailed too close. so the evidence of death is visible. Every captain approaching the island can see exactly what happens if you keep going that direction. And yet they sail toward it anyway, not because they are foolish, but because the song is irresistible. And here's a detail that every modern retelling of the story misses. The sirens are not offering pleasure. They're not promising sex. They're not promising luxury or comfort. They're not seductive because they are beautiful women. Listen to what they actually promise Odysseus. Come closer, famous Odysseus. Listen to our song. No one has ever sailed past us without becoming a wiser man. Do you hear what they are actually offering? It's not pleasure. It's wisdom. They claim to know everything that has happened at Troy, everything that has happened across the world, all the misfortunes that Odysseus have had to face. So they promised Odysseus something different, something he has always wanted his entire life, the complete story of himself. In other words, they promise him the perfect self-understanding. And I think this is one of the most sophisticated psychologically scenes in the entire Odyssey, because it describes something we almost never recognize. Some temptations are not attractive because of what they give us. They are attractive because of what they seem to know about us. Think about the relationship you keep returning to, not because it makes you happy, but because that person carries a version of you that no one else sees, that no one else remembers. Or the career you cannot live because your identity was forged there and you no longer know who you are without it. Or the same emotional dynamic you recreate again and again because underneath the suffering, somehow it feels strangely familiar. And that is the Sirens song. It is not seducing you with something outside yourself. It's seducing you with a version of yourself that you crave it to be understood. So this is our shadow borrowing one of our deepest psychological needs, the desire to be fully seen. And the desire to be fully seen is healthy. It is what brings people into therapy. It is what drives intimacy. It is what pushes us towards growth. But the shadow has a remarkable ability to imitate some legitimate needs that we have while pushes us towards destructive solutions. And that is why intelligent people fall for the Sirens song. It doesn't feel like self-destruction. It feels like finally being understood. And that is Homer's genius, because he understood that the most dangerous temptation is not the one that appeals to your weaknesses. It is the one that appeals to one of our deepest legitimate needs, but quietly it convinces us that distraction is the price for fulfilling it. The need is real. The song is a counterfeit. And now notice what Odysseus does, because this is just as important as the temptation itself. He doesn't block his own ears. His crew fills their ears with beeswax so they cannot hear the song at all. But Odysseus asks to hear it. Before they reach the island, he orders his men to tie him tightly to the mast, and no matter what he says later, not to release him. As the ship passes, he hears everything. He wants to go. Every part of him, every cell of his body wants to follow the voice. He screams, he begs, he fights against the ropes. But he cannot act. And I find that psychologically fascinating, because the solution is not that he becomes immune to the temptation. The solution is not that he stops wanting it either. The solution is that he creates a structure before temptation arrives. He knows that the person making decisions before hearing the song is wiser than the person who will be making the decision during the song. And how many of our biggest mistakes have happened because we trust ourselves at precisely the very moment we are the least trustworthy. The ropes become something much larger than ropes. They represent commitment, they represent boundaries, they represent discipline. Sometimes even the people we trust enough to stop us from becoming the worst version of ourselves. So the point is not to eliminate desire, the point is to survive it. And Homer tells us that Odysseus leaves the island having heard the entire song. He feels it at its full force. He experiences every ounce of the longing. but he keeps sailing. This is what matters, because growth is not the absence of temptation. Growth is developing the capacity to experience temptation fully without allowing it to determine your actions. So let me ask you something. What is your siren song? Not generally, but specifically. What is the relationship? What is the ambition? What is the story? What is the identity? Or what is the version of yourself that keeps calling you back because it promises to finally make you feel understood? And if you found yourself standing in front of that version tomorrow, would you trust yourself to make the decision in that moment? Or have you tied yourself to the mast beforehand? Because if the song feels like home, that is exactly the moment you should ask whether it is leading you there or away from it. And now we sail to Calypso's island, the shadow that stops the journey. This encounter is one almost nobody talks about, not because it is unimportant, quite the opposite. Homer opens the Odyssey with that encounter. When the poem begins, Odysseus isn't fighting monsters or escaping storms. He is already on Calypso's island, and he has been there for years. What makes Calypso so psychologically fascinating is that, unlike every other obstacle in the Odyssey, she never looks like an obstacle at all. There's no violence, there's no obvious danger, there's no dragon to slay, only an island so beautiful that Homer lingers over its description. He spends so many verses about the description of the forests, the flowing rivers, the birds singing, vines heavy with grapes, a fire that never goes out, and Calypso herself, a goddess who genuinely loves Odysseus and offers him something no human being has ever been offered: immortality. She tells him, "Stay with me. You will never grow old. You will never die. The sea will never hurt you again. Your suffering is over. Only if you stay with me." And think about that temptation for a moment. After 10 years of war in Troy, after years of wandering in the seas, the loss of almost every man he sailed with, hunger, storms, grief, who shouldn't accept that gift? And yet Homer gives us one more haunting image. Every night Odysseus sleeps beside Calypso, but every morning he walks alone to the rocks at the edge of the island, and he stares across the sea and he cries. That image alone tells us everything, because the deepest prisons are rarely built with chains. Sometimes they are built with comfort. Sometimes they are built with everything you have ever wanted. And I think this is one of the most misunderstood patterns in modern life. Most people assume that suffering is what keeps us from becoming ourselves. But very often it isn't. Very often it's comfort that keeps us from becoming ourselves. It's the job that pays you well enough that you never live, but never challenges you to become who you're capable of becoming. It's the relationship that you genuinely cared for, yet something inside you quietly dies because neither of you asks the other to grow. It's the life that leaves you with that strange feeling that you have stopped moving forward. Nothing is wrong, and yet something essential is missing. You feel that big emptiness inside you. This is why Calypso is so much more dangerous than the Cyclops. The Cyclops wants to kill Odysseus, but Calypso wants him to live forever and stay there with her. And psychologically, those are very different dangers. Carl Jung had a concept that he called the pure aeternus, the eternal child. Not childish in the physical sense, but someone who postpones the weight of fully inhabiting their own life because of the comfort of their house. Someone who always keeps one foot outside commitment, outside responsibility, outside destiny. Calypso represents exactly that temptation. She doesn't tempt Odysseus with pleasure. She tempts him with permanence, with the possibility that he never has to risk anything again, especially himself. That he will never fall again. He will never suffer again. He will never feel hurt again. Only remain there. And that's why her island is so beautiful, because stagnation almost never announces itself as stagnation. It announces itself as security, as stability, as enough. And enough can quietly become the greatest enemy of growth. So Odysseus makes the choice of living. When Zeus orders Calypso to release him, she gives him one final opportunity to stay. She reminds him that Penelope is mortal while she is immortal. She reminds him that life with her would be easier, safer, more beautiful. Odysseus doesn't hesitate. He chooses Ithaca, not because Ithaca is better, not because it is easier, but because it is his. And that raises a difficult question. Is there a Calypso in your own life? Not necessarily a person, maybe it's an arrangement, maybe it's a routine, maybe it's a version of your life that is comfortable enough to stay in, but too comfortable to grow beyond. The interesting thing is that people caught in this pattern don't usually describe themselves as unhappy. They describe themselves as contained, as though a better version of themselves exists somewhere beyond this life they're currently living. Everything looks fine. Everyone tells them they should be happy, they should be grateful. Yet every morning, some part of them still sits on the rocks, looking toward the sea, waiting for a journey they already know they have to make. So, will you choose comfort, or will you choose Ithaca? So Odysseus finally leaves Calypso's island. He builds a raft with his own hands. And I love that detail because Homer could simply have said that he sailed away. Instead, he makes sure we know that Odysseus builds the vessel himself. After everything he has learned, nobody carries him home, despite the fact that he's a king. He has to construct the final stage of his journey with his own hands. Calypso even helps him, and that's another remarkable detail. The very force that kept him there now helps him live. And psychologically, I think that this is very profound because once a person genuinely decides to move forward, even the things that one kept him back are the ones that will try to propel him forward. And psychologically, I think that this is really powerful because once a person genuinely decides to move forward, even the things that once kept them stuck behind start to lose their power over them. But the journey home is not easy. Poseidon has not forgotten his name. He sends one final storm, the raft is destroyed, and Odysseus nearly drowns. He washes ashore exhausted, stripped of everything, with nothing but his own life remaining. And this is how Homer chooses the homecoming of the hero. Not with triumph, not with victory, not with applaud, but with a man crawling out of the sea with nothing left. And I think this is where we also misunderstand what transformation looks like. We have this glossy image that we see on social media that, oh, I became self-aware now, I'm a yogi and I sit cross-legged behind my swimming pool. We imagine that someone who has done the inner work should look confident, they should look polished, they should look completely certain of themselves. But real psychological growth often looks exactly like the opposite. It looks like losing identities that once protected you. It looks like letting go of certainty. It looks, at least for a while, like becoming smaller before becoming whole. Odysseus arrives with nothing because everything unnecessary has been already stripped away. This is what psychological transformation looks like. It's painful. And he arrives to the Phoenicians' island. So the Phoenicians receive him, they feed him, they clothe him. And they ask only for one thing in return. Tell us your story. And Odysseus does. And for the first time, he tells them everything. The Cyclops, the Sirens, Circe, Calypso, his mistakes, his victories, his arrogance, his grief, his failures, everything. He hides nothing from them. And this is where I think we should stay for a moment, because healing is not simply surviving your experience. Healing is being able to tell the whole story without editing out any part that embarrasses you, without removing the moments that you were proud or weak or afraid or irresponsible or responsible. Because the moment you can tell your story honestly, fully, completely, it no longer controls you unconsciously. That's what integration really is. It's not forgetting about your past. It's becoming capable of carrying it. And only after Odysseus tells them the whole story, the Phoenicians take him back to Ithaca. Not before. And I don't think that this is accidental, because anyone that can truly come home to their true self, they must first have to stop lying to themselves about the story of their lives, about the journey that brought them there. When Odysseus finally reaches Ithaca after 20 years, Homer gives us one final surprise. He doesn't arrive as a king, he arrives disguised as a beggar. Of all the ways Homer could have ended the story, this is the one I find most psychologically brilliant. Remember the man who stood on the ship shouting his name at Polyphemus? The man who needed the monster to know who had defeated him? That man no longer exists. Now Odysseus walks through his own kingdom completely anonymous. People insult him, ignore him, mock him. His own servants fail to recognize him. The suitors occupying his house treat him as though he is garbage, as though he is nobody. And this time, he says nothing. He stays nobody. That is his real victory. Not defeating monsters, not surviving storms, not even reaching Ithaca. The real victory is the man who once couldn't tolerate anonymity has finally become capable of carrying it. That is what 20 years of shadow work produced. Not perfection, not freedom, not a polished image. He no longer needs recognition to know who he is. And that's one of the clearest signs of psychological maturity, when your identity no longer depends on being seen, when your value no longer depends on being acknowledged, when your actions stop being performance for other people and start becoming expressions of who you truly are. Only then is Odysseus ready to reveal himself, not because he needs people to recognize him, but because the moment finally requires it. And that is a difference. And then comes one of the most beautiful moments in the entire Odyssey. Penelope devises a test. She announces that she will marry the man who can carry Odysseus' great bow and send an arrow through 12 axe heads aligned in a perfect row. One after another, the suitors try, and one after another, they fail. Not because they lack strength, but because the bow was never simply about strength. It belonged to one man because it had become part of the man's identity. It was something no one else could imitate. So Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, quietly asks if he can try. The room laughs because no one sees a king, no one sees a hero. All they see is an old beggar. So he picks up the bow and he pulls the string effortlessly. He draws the arrow and sends it clearly through all 12 axe heads. Only then is he recognized, not because he finally tells everyone his name, not because he announces who he is, but because his nature reveals itself. And this is one of the deepest psychological ideas Homer gives us, which is that your real identity is never proven by what you say about yourself. It's revealed by what you can do, by the capacities you have cultivated, by the way you move through the world, by the unique expression of who you have become after years of struggle. Because reputation belongs to the world, but character belongs to you. And eventually, character speaks louder than reputation ever could. And this is where Penelope recognizes him, because she isn't looking for appearance. She's looking for essence. So, through the entire Odyssey, she has been waiting and she has been doing her own kind of psychological work. Because while Odysseus is fighting monsters for 20 years, Penelope is fighting time inside the palace. She weaves during the day and secretly unravels the weaving during the night. She refuses to let the story end before the right man returns. Now pay attention to this image, because psychologically, again, it's magnificent. There is something inside every one of us that remembers who we are, even when we ourselves have forgotten. We call it the self, the higher self, the consciousness. Call it however you want, your deepest nature. I don't care. But however you name it, it's there. There's a part of you that keeps waiting patiently while the rest of you gets lost. It doesn't panic. It doesn't disappear. It simply waits until you're ready to return. That's what Penelope is. She isn't Odysseus' wife. She's the symbol of the part of the psyche that never stopped knowing that you will come home one day. And perhaps this is also why their reunion doesn't feel like every other reunion that you see in the cinema. It doesn't come with a victorious poem, because this isn't a king reclaiming its kingdom. It's a person becoming themselves again. So what has Homer really been trying to tell us through thousands of years? I don't think it's a story about monsters or gods or war or anything of that sort. It's about something much more personal. It's about the long journey back to yourself. The Cyclops teaches us that pride doesn't destroy us during the battle. It destroys us after the battle, when we need recognition more than we need wisdom. The Sirens teach us that the most dangerous temptation is not pleasure, it's the counterfeit versions of our deepest desires and needs. Circe teaches us that comfort without awareness slowly transforms us into something we no longer recognize. And Calypso teaches us that a beautiful prison is still a prison. So what about Ithaca? Ithaca reminds us that none of those encounters were ever interruptions to the journey. They were the journey. Every monster Odysseus meets is another part of himself. Every delay is another lesson that hasn't yet been integrated. Every setback is another invitation to becoming a little more whole. And that's why Homer does not reward Odysseus for being the strongest man. He rewards him for becoming a different man. Not perfect, but integrated. And perhaps that's what Jung meant when he said that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. Not creating a new self, but recovering the one that was there all along. Because Ithaca was never simply a place on a map. It was always the version of Odysseus that was capable of becoming. And perhaps your own Ithaca works exactly the same way. The destination is not waiting somewhere outside of you. It is waiting on the other side of the parts of yourself you have spent a lifetime avoiding. And maybe that's why this story still survives after 3,000 years almost. Because every person who reads the Odyssey thinks they're reading the story of an adventure, until one day they realize that they've been reading their own story. I'm Dimitris of Psychology, and if you want to work with me, you'll find all my details in the description below. Until next time, always keep asking, what is that thing within me that makes me do the things I do?